President Zelensky did not tell you the truth, but simply lied to you. President Zelensky mentioned negotiations in at least two dimensions. First, when he categorically refused to comply with the Minsk agreements and all the time appealed to his Western patrons with an appeal to convene the Normandy format both with or without reason. He hasn't given any guarantees that these meetings would have any results. These calls were aimed at replacing the concrete work that was required of President Zelensky in order to implement the agreements reached during previous rounds of negotiations. And the second example, when President Zelensky called for negotiations, are his calls for negotiations to be held on the matter of joining NATO, to provide him with security guarantees through NATO. It was all open and quite recently, on everyone's lips. In the same row, there were also threats that Ukraine, if it is not protected in accordance with the Budapest Memorandum, will be free from obligations not to have nuclear weapons. I hope that everyone has read the Budapest Memorandum. There is no obligation to recognize anti-state coups. There is no obligation to meet the regime that declared genocide against the happiness of its own people, speaking out against the Russian language, against Russian education, against many things that are directly related to Russian culture and are an essential part of modern Ukrainian society. Therefore, there is no shortage of opportunities that were missed by President Zelensky. We proposed discussing security guarantees last December, and he was well aware of this. There was only one condition: to fulfill the requirements of the agreements that were signed at the highest level within the framework of the OSCE, so that no one tries to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others. He did not want to fulfill this obligation, just as his Western patrons. And everyone said that the freedom to choose an alliance as a means of ensuring Ukrainian security is sacred. Therefore, he is now telling you lies, when he declares that he is ready to discuss the neutral status. We offered all kinds of security options. President Putin said bluntly, NATO expansion is unacceptable, but we want to work together to find security options that will guarantee appropriate opportunities for Ukraine, for European countries and, of course, for the Russian Federation. Our security initiatives of last December are aimed specifically to search for a guarantee beyond the expansion of military political blocs, primarily NATO. Therefore, President Zelensky is well aware of the missed opportunities. We do not see the possibility of recognizing as democratic a government that oppresses and applies genocidal methods to its own people. Do democratic society ban the usage of a language spoken by the majority of the population? Do democracies ban education in the Russian language, or any language spoken by society? Could it ban using mother tongue in everyday life, for example, in shops and hotels? And is it customary in a democratic society to say that the people who now live in one particular part of the country are not people, not humans, but specimen, as President Zelensky put it? If English were suddenly banned in Ireland, how would the UK react? Or if French was banned in Belgium? I do not think that such an initiative would have lasted more than a few hours. But in the West, everything is perceived through the prism of their own interests. When West is impaired in some way, it immediately begins to raise a fuss. But when the rights of millions of people in Ukraine are impaired, it emphasizes not human rights, but the so-called democratic nature of the regime that is responsible for it. All these 8 years, zero Western companies, including the media, has provided constant coverage of events on the lines of contact. At the same time, our journalists worked all year round and showed the truth: how the civilian sector was destroyed, how women and children were killed. We have always advocated a diplomatic solution. It was Russia that played the decisive role in laying a solid foundation for a diplomatic solution, I mean the Minsk agreements. It was Russia that played the decisive role in persuading the DPR and LPR to sign the Minsk agreements, which guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, provided that Donbass was given a special status, the right to have its own law enforcement agencies, to have special economic ties with Russia. This should have been enshrined in the Constitution. An amnesty should have been declared. The economic blockade should have been lifted. But this whole foundation was destroyed. We tried to convince Kiev and its Western patrons to force Kiev to comply with the agreements. No one lifted a finger to stop the sabotage carried out by Poroshenko and, later, Zelensky. Our public appeals have remained a voice crying in the wilderness. I cannot believe that Western politicians and diplomats, constantly rejecting our attempts to force Kiev to comply with the Minsk agreements, believed that this would be the case forever. Nobody is going to attack the Ukrainian people. No one is going to treat Ukrainian servicemen in a degrading manner. It is about not allowing neo-Nazis and those who promote genocidal methods to rule in this country. Because now Ukraine is under two mechanisms of external control, the West, led by the United States, and neo-Nazis. Read what Putin said. There are no strikes on civilian infrastructure. There are no strikes on the deployment of personnel that are not associated with military installations. Why for all these 8 years no Western journalist has been covering on a permanent basis what is happening on the Western line of contact with the Donbass? You are now horrified by what is happening in Kiev, but has anyone from CNN been to the Donbass itself? Has he seen how schools are destroyed, how women who carried babies in their arms were killed? How are carpet bombings of the children's beach carried out? Has anyone been there?